It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. Kawa Hassan is a non-resident fellow with Stimson Center's Middle East and North Africa program, founder of Shrova Strategies and a consultancy focused on MENA affairs and EU-MENA relations. Mr. Hassan served as executive director of Stimson Europe, director of MENA program, and senior fellow. In these roles, he transferred the Brussels office and MENA program of EastWest Institute, EWI, to the Stimson Center, established Stimson Europe, the first overseas office of Stimson Center, led projects and staff, oversaw finance, fundraising, and administration. Prior to joining the Stimson Center, Mr. Hassan served as vice president and director of the MENA program at EWI. In these two senior executive positions, he consolidated and expanded the MENA program and led the implementation of 8 Track 2 diplomacy projects. During his tenure at EWI, Mr. Hassan worked on programs designed to building trust between Iranian and Saudi officials and experts, brought together officials and experts from Iraq, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, Kuwait, and Turkey, and produced policy recommendations on how Iraq could transform to a center for regional cooperation. He worked with top French and American diplomats to mediate the two parties, and he developed practical policy proposals to improve economic ties between Algeria and Morocco. Mr. Hassan holds a master's degree in international relations and political science from the University of Amsterdam. Mr. Hassan, welcome.
Thank you so much, Samantha, for the kind introduction, and good afternoon. And thank you so much, Max and the team, for the kind invitation to speak at the 5th Annual Summit. It's really a pleasure to join David, Nancy, Peter, Greg at this previous panel and now speaking at this panel. So I was telling Max, this is the first time I visit South Carolina and also participate at the annual summit of Mroz Global Leadership Institute. But since I worked at EastWest Institute, EWI, from 2015 to 2021, and given the transition, of EWI to College of Charleston, to me, it really feels like coming back home, literally. And I couldn't, as a former EWI staffer, I couldn't think and dream of really a better institutional home for EastWest Institute than College of Charleston and under the leadership of Max. So for me, it's very special to be here today. Thank you. And Max asked me to talk about civil society and post-conflict development in Syria and Iraq. First, I thought, and I suggested I'll speak about October 7 and its regional ramification. And Max said, maybe we can do that at another session, but why not Iraq and Syria? I said, wow, that's really a great idea, because the topic of post-conflict development, as you can tell from the previous session, but particularly in Syria and Iraq, is very close to my heart, literally, personally and professionally. I'm Dutch from Iraqi Kurdish descent, and I've been working on civil society development in Iraq, in Syria, and the rest of Middle East since 2003. So this topic, is very, very dear to my heart. And what makes it even more interesting, the topic, is that often we underestimate the impact of the authoritarian regimes on civil society development. And for those who are familiar with the history of Iraq and Syria, they used to be ruled by probably the most two brutal authoritarian regimes in the history of Middle East, both Ba'ath Party, Arab nationalist parties. In the case of Syria, Hafez al-Assad, and later on his son Bashar al-Assad ruled the country literally for 50 years, half a century with iron fist. In the case of Iraq, of course, Saddam Hussein, from 1968 to 2003, again with iron fist. So when we want to understand how civil society can contribute to post-conflict development in Syria and Iraq, we should really go back to the roots of the political regimes. The current state of civil society in both countries don't help us to understand its roots. So we should go back to the roots of the political regimes which were there for the past 50 years or so. And my understanding of civil society is that, you know, it's an enormous tool, but also, you know, organization to development, trust building, and conflict resolution, but also improve human rights and good governance. In a normal democracy, these are tough topics to deal with. So you can imagine trying to bring about social change in a post-authoritarian state like Iraq and Syria, and what, you know, realistically should be expected from civil society in such a context. From 2008 to 2015, I had the privilege to lead a research program from Holland, from a Dutch NGO called HIVOS in The Hague, on state-society relations in authoritarian states. Iran, Syria in particular, but also the rest of Middle East. And I had the privilege really to working with civil society activists in the case of Syria. And this was before the uprising, which started in 2011 and later on led to the fall of Assad. From 2008 to 2011, till Bashar al-Assad was in power. And I had the privilege to working with some really exceptional leaders from civil society in Syria and outside Syria. And at some point, I told, you know, a group of these veteran civil society activists, artists, researchers, why don't you try to document your experience? And this was before the fall of Assad. We can think about a way to, you know, publish it under pseudonyms, but it would be a pity, you know, if all these experiences would, you know, would disappear. And initially, there was some reluctance to that, obviously, for obvious reasons, because of, you know, an authoritarian regime in place. But then later on, they said yes. So we worked on a document, a paper. It's called Civil Society Against All Odds. It's available online. And we had really some great people who contributed to that, 7 or 8 chapters. And it's not an academic book. It's a paper written by practitioners, reflecting on their experience as civil society activists in an authoritarian state. So we had people who, we had someone who passed away, Hassan Abbas. He wrote about his experience, which is quite revolutionary. He said, Kawa, I had to set up an event for reading and discussing books, late 90s, early 2000s in Damascus for young students to debate about a book every week. It was done secretly in the garage of his home. He brought a group of students, tell them, listen, this is a book of, I don't know, X philosopher or a Roman, whatever. Read it, you come, and then we discuss it. And of course, after building trust between them that, you know, they will not go to the intelligence service and report them, right? To me, that was a great experience. He said, you know, Hassan, you should write about this, you know, and he wrote an excellent chapter about that experience. And it worked that, you know, I mean, that was a great attempt to develop what he called critical thinking for students. Even in an authoritarian state, you should be able to think critically without putting yourself in danger. That was his way of, you know, developing critical thinking for students. Another contributor to that paper was a medical doctor. And his really experience was, even for someone like me who comes from the region, was shocking. And he said, Kawa, I wanted to start a research center a medical research center on cancer in Aleppo. Zero politics. You do just research about cancer. And he said he submitted so many requests to the governments, every time they said no, 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 no. And finally he gave up. Why? Because they can't stand a researcher, even a doctor, to establish an independent research center, which is not linked to government. So in the end, he gave up his dream. But luckily now he's back in Aleppo and he is working on that and some other ideas. So what I'm trying to say with these two examples is that totalitarian regimes like Syria, like in Syria, Assad, Iraq, what do they do with society? I call it atomization of society from atom. They atomize society, which means that they literally dismember societies into separate islands and entities which are alien to each other. They destroy civil society, space, but also the social fabric of society. They turn people, and this is the most dangerous impact, they turn people against each other. Those also who are familiar with Eastern Europe, East Germany, other countries can really tell a lot of story about that. How even within one family, people were turned against each other. And in that process, what happened is that decimation of society, civil space. It got decimated in Syria. So basically, the impact of authoritarianism is that they destroy the very basics needed for a healthy civil society space. Namely, people should trust each other and should jointly develop actions, projects, and share a vision for a better society. That is the legacy of authoritarianism, even decades after their demise. And I will get back to that later on. Yet, as I said, despite this, the impact of authoritarianism, there are always in authoritarian states brave individuals like Hassan Abbas, like Fuad, that doctor, and many more, There are always brave people who try within the available space to, try to do something good in their societies. And after the death of those who are familiar with Syria, Hafiz Assad ruled Syria until from 1970 until 2000, then he died. His son Bashar came to power. And initially there was some hope that change might come to Syria finally. And like all other authoritarian regimes, they start well, only for a short while time, So he opened the space for civil society activists and something started like what is called Damascus Spring. Intellectuals, activists were given space for a few years to open fora for discussion about social reform, political reform, something like what Hassan Abbas did in his garage, years ago. People were very excited. And they took advantage of that opportunity. But like a good dictator, then you end that space as soon as possible. As soon as you see that it's getting out of control. Was good. Now we close the space. He did. A lot of people were arrested, killed, and others fled. And I had the pleasure to work with some of those people from 2008 until 2015. So fast forward to 2011, we had the uprisings in Middle East, the so-called Arab Spring, which I don't want to use because it's a different discussion. It's a wrong word for something revolutionary. Anyhow, Arab Spring, let's call it that way. So the uprising started in Syria as well. And I have to admit, I didn't see it coming, even with my experience. And even the Syrians themselves, those who used to work inside Syria for decades, they never saw it coming. And that is the beauty of historic developments. I think it was the Italian philosopher Gramsci who said, there are decades where nothing happens. No, it was Lenin. Sorry, Gramsci, it was Lenin. It was Vladimir Lenin. And he said, there are decades where nothing happens, and there are weeks where decades happen. That was 10, 15 years before the fall of the Romanov in Russia. You don't need to be a fan of Lenin, but a good proverb, a good saying is a good saying, regardless who said it. So going back to 2011, I didn't see it coming. Many people didn't see it coming, and it happened. There was a lot, really big hope back then that this time around may work. But no, it was suppressed by the brutal, suppression by Bashar al-Assad, but also regional states who strengthened violent Islamist groups who are today in power in Damascus. They changed their clothes, but ideology is still the same. So back then, again, there was really a lot of hope that this time around things may work. And I have to say, from 2011 until the fall of Assad regime in early December 2024, Syrian civil society really made great achievement, both inside Syria in liberated areas, but also abroad. And for the first time, they, came together, they trusted each other, they worked on multiple issues for the day after: transitional justice, good governance, rule of law, human rights, all in the hope of that one day, once Assad has gone, they will go back and put these things in practice. Again, nobody expected actually that Assad would fall, in early December. He fell, and then who came to power? Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, Ahmed al-Shara, previously Abu Muhammad Jolani, someone from jihadi Salafi roots. And I have to admit that, he has definitely changed in terms of his performance. And he had some good trainings from some also Western NGOs as how to be a good politician, how to transform from a previous terrorist to a statesman. So he's doing justice to that, and to that training and capacity building. Literally, it was capacity building for him. And but what has not changed is the political mentality of those who actually in power today. Those who follow the developments in Syria since the fall of Assad, they see a scary comparison between the previous regime and the current regime, even though they come from two different political schools, namely the same authoritarian politics that produced them. And that is, in my view, it's very scary to say, probably that is one of the ultimate victories of Assad's authoritarianism. He laid the ground for post-Assad authoritarianism. And of course, the fact that Ahmed al-Shah came to power is not only attributed to him, but to the geopolitical developments in the region and the support from regional states. But that aside, what we have today in Syria, and that was, as I said, me, others, Syrian, they said, some people said, probably I would never, ever see the day that Assad has gone. Well, he has gone. And they said, what matters, Assad should go. What comes afterwards is not important. Nothing could be worse than Assad. Nothing could be worse than Assad. Well, I was also taken by that euphoria in the early weeks, but I managed to regroup and recontrol myself. Because I thought this is a historic moment for Syria. Definitely, this is a historic moment. And, but what happened is that the geopolitics has definitely way more, tools at its disposal than civil society activism. Having said that, this is not to diminish the importance of civil society, but civil society should also be put in the right context to make sure that hope for change, efforts to bring about change will not, be disappointed too soon. So what I'm trying to say is that over the past 2 years, in the case of Syria, and I'll come to Iraq a bit later, big hope in Syria that things will change. And definitely there is more space today, and this should be said, there is today more space for civil society inside Syria, despite the authoritarianism of the new rulers. Absolutely. Some of the great practitioners, civil society activists who are abroad went back to Syria, and within their available space, they do what they can. They say, if we are not here, it might be too late. There is something to say for that, but you've got also those people who say, no, you shouldn't. It's difficult discussion for them. But what happened is that, and there are worrying signs when it comes to the space for civil society in Syria today. For those who follow the developments in Syria for the past 2 years, there were massacres against the Alawites, who happened accidentally that Bashar Assad, he was an Alawite, but he doesn't speak for Alawites. The majority of Alawites are actually poor, but the whole belief was that for the past 50 years, it is the Alawite community who is responsible for all our disaster. So they should be targeted as a community. And that was the original sin committed by the new regime, And there were massacres against them. Of course, they are powerless because, they never had Druze and Kurds. They never had, armed groups to protect them. And, they were seen as the group was responsible for the dictatorship of Assad. And then what happened is that I call it mobile massacres. So they moved from the coastal area to the south. The new regime with tribal leaders, and they started killing the Druze, a small Islamic, very liberal community. Last month, they took on Kurds in northeast. This is the current state of the transition in Syria. This is the current state within which civil society operates. And as I said, the current discussion within civil society in Syria is that those who went back, they say, let's give him a chance. And they gave him a chance, also internationally. But and from my own experience in Iraq after 2003, when Saddam Hussein fell, what you build on a wrong foundation, it's difficult to reform it later. It's very difficult to reform because you create new power centers which have interest in maintaining the new regime. And in an authoritarian state, it's difficult to reform it. Probably, it should be ended only with violence. And that's a very sad conclusion. Going back to Syria, so you've got a discussion between two groups. Those who say we should go back and do what we can, and those who say no. If you support the regime today, tomorrow is too late to reform it. And that is where we are now in Syria at this very moment. And time will tell how this will unfold. We don't know. What we definitely know is that this new regime, led by Ahmad al-Sharah, a former Al-Qaeda terrorist, claims to have changed, has regional and international legitimacy, continues to get support, but the signs are very worrying in Syria for the entire region. Because this new regime needs to empower jihadi Salafi ideology. It's a small group, very capable, very powerful, came out of the civil war, battle-hardened, absolutely. They mastered the politics. But if Osama bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri, as leaders of Al-Qaeda, if you talk to them right now from their graves, they said, mission achieved, actually, mission accomplished. Look at that. Ahmad al-Shara is at power in Syria, and Taliban is back in Afghanistan. Mission accomplished. We did what we could, right? And I'm very worried about the developments in Syria for the entire region, for the fact that, as I said, the current regime, to stay in power, they need to empower jihadi Salafi ideology, and they are working on it every day. Yes, they are fighting ISIS, but what happens in the meantime is that ISIS ideology is incorporated in the state structure. And I think this will backfire, first for Syrians, but also for the entire region. The history of Middle East tells us those who played with religious groups, and Afghanistan tells us those who play with jihadi Salafi groups, it will backfire on them. It backfired in Afghanistan, backfired in other countries, and it will backfire in Syria. Now, moving to Iraq. The Iraqi civil society post-2003 went definitely through a different transition, because the history of Iraq is different from Syria. Of course, both were ruled by Ba'ath Party, but the history is completely different. And what is common with Assad, the Syria's Assad, is that also Saddam Hussein decimated the civil society that existed, by the way. There was an embryonic civil society in Iraq from the monarchy through to 1968. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't democratic, but we had the basics. We had them. We had syndicates. We had, a relative space for development of independent activism. That was completely destroyed, decimated by Saddam Hussein. The only place which enjoyed a relative, freedom for civil society was Kurdistan region, and that was from 1991, because, of the protection of US, France, and UK, and because it has its own autonomy. And what happened is that after 2003, we have had really an interesting development of civil society activism in Iraq. And two actors played here an essential role. First, the former opposition to Saddam Hussein. They were, Kurds, leftist, some self-styled liberal, and some Islamists. They played an important role afterwards to, establish civil society groups, of course, for their own interests, but also at the end of the day, it helped to open this space. And that should be mentioned, US played an important role, United States, an important role, an historic role. Support civil society, independent civil society activism after 2003. There were huge mistakes made. I know that books have been written about it, absolutely. But in the grand scheme of things, here, this is a case study where US definitely played an important role in supporting the civil society post-2003. And there are some colleagues here who, who worked in Iraq, who know that, and that should be said. But the role and impact of civil society was impacted by donor funding, international engagement, and co-optation and repression by the ruling elites. The ruling elites in post-2003, and now they have, they have the tools, they know how to co-opt civil society, they learn from other authoritarian regimes. Despite that, Iraqi civil society has played really, over the past 20 years, an important role in particularly on local peace building, which is very important. And some of the projects were supported by USIP and USID in Iraq, local peace building efforts. Mediation and trust building. And also US supported media development, independent media development in Iraq. A good example is Al Hurra TV channel, which played an important role in the early days of the liberation. in opening the media space. And now, the good news is that increasingly also universities, independent think tanks, and also party-related think tanks are also active in knowledge production and research on the role of civil society in social change. And I'll finish now. My last comment is that after the fall of Assad regime, I tried to think about how Iraq, post-Saddam Iraq, could help post-Assad Syria, the civil society in Iraq, given its experience, from 2003 to 2024. And I spoke to a lot of activists in Iraq, researchers, and one idea which I came away with it, and it's in a piece of my on Stimson website, is that the need for knowledge production on Syria. One of the biggest victories of authoritarianism is that they destroy knowledge production about own society because they atomize the civil society. Syrians are rediscovering Syria, actually, because they didn't know each other. They were afraid of each other. They rediscover communities, they rediscover regions, and they come together despite the difficulties. The same happened in Iraq. So knowledge production, I told them, how can you help Syrian civil society? They told them, Kawa, knowledge production. We are hungry for knowledge about Syria. We knew only Bashar al-Assad. We want to know the other Syria. So I told them, okay, start a project between think tanks from Syria and Iraq, universities, get together, know each other, and transfer your knowledge. And I'm really, I'm very happy that, they took that advice and they organized the first ever meeting between Syrian Iraqi think tanks last year, where they brought the embryonic think tank community in Syria to Iraq. They met their peers in Iraq, they met with decision makers, and they helped at least to, educate Iraqis about the Syrian society. And I'll leave it there, Max. Thank you. I hope that I didn't, overstay my time. So look forward to the questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was such an interesting topic. I wanted to pick your brain a little bit on what you think about Turkey's involvement in Syria, especially right before the fall of Assad, and protecting different ISIS leaders that were right on the border of Syria, and what you think about that and how that relates to the ongoing situation.
Thanks. So Turkey, one of the biggest winners of this great change in Syria is Turkey. And Turkey even played a role actually in the, in the operations in the run-up to the fall of Assad. I mean, Assad was going to fall anyway because it was a fragile regime. But what helped his fall was October 7, 2 words, October 7. Without October 7, and the fact that Israel destroyed almost Hezbollah and attacked Iran, and that so-called axis of resistance has been weakened, and Russia busy in Ukraine, difficult for me to imagine the fall of Assad in the way it happened, So Turkey is a winner, definitely. But there's a new Cold War in Syria between Israel and Turkey. And probably this will be one of the defining dynamics in the coming years, how, in terms of the impact on stability and post-conflict political recovery in Syria. When it comes to ISIS, this is a huge headache, I would say, for Syrians, for Iraqis, for the entire region, particularly now. Because after the weakening of the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces, the Syrian government took control of major camps, which was used to prison some top leaders of ISIS, really the most dangerous ISIS leaders you can imagine, and their families. And by the way, even so, I mean, imagine, and I have visited one of those camps, you see a children of 9 years old. ISIS has been defeated territorially, but actually ISIS is kicking alive there. As they say, we are here to stay in their brain, So they used to call these camps the best universities for graduation of terrorists, unfortunately. You don't need a PhD, but you get it. You get it there, right? Because of the circumstances. But this is a big issue right now. And after what happened to SDF and the freeing of families and kids, and now almost 6,000 ISIS leaders have been taken to Iraq, which is a good news, but damage has been done. Some people are on the loose, and that their ideology is spreading. That's all I can say.
Thank you. That was very interesting. I was hoping you could tell us your perspective on what do you think the implications are of the recent offensive in the Rojava area in Syria, and what you think the consequences of that will be with them losing so much territory and autonomy.
Thank you so much. So for those who don't know the phrase Rojava in Kurdish, which is my mother tongue, it means west, and it's used in Syria for Western Kurdistan. So for Kurds, Iraqi Kurdistan and Southern Kurdistan, a very a crash course about Kurdish history. So Iraqi Kurdistan is Southern Kurdistan, Iranian Kurdistan is Eastern Kurdistan, Kurdistan in Turkey is Northern Kurdistan, and Syria is the Western Kurdistan, and the word Rojava, which means Western. So thanks for mentioning that. So the implications are, I think they are very worrying. Worrying not so much because of the territories they lost, because some of the territories they lost, there were, Arab majority, areas. In my view, they shouldn't have gone there in the first place. Probably that was a strategic mistake. But that's not the question. The biggest risk is that you've got an empowered ruling elite in Damascus, supported regionally, with ISIS families on the loose. They have one common enemy, Kurds. Why? Because Kurds and SDF, Syrian Democratic Forces, they were the ones who defeated ISIS in 2019. And those who are familiar with the Syrian Kurdistan, female fighters, they played an enormous role in that war. For them, Kurds are the ones who defeated them with indispensable support of US. Without US support, ISIS will not be defeated in Iraq and Syria, period. That was crucial. That was indispensable. What happens right now is that US is withdrawing. Of course, US has to withdraw at some point from Syria. Syrians should take responsibility for their own country. Absolutely, no doubt about that. But going back to your question, I think there was a moment 3 weeks ago that a genocide might be forthcoming. And for now, hopefully that has been averted because of US pressure. But there is zero trust. Kurds have zero trust in the rulers in Damascus. And that's why we don't know what will happen in the coming weeks and months. There's an agreement between them. I hope it will be implemented. The security part of it has been implemented. It's been implemented gradually. I hope with sustained US pressure that at some point there will be a sustained long-term ceasefire. The agreement will be implemented, and then a new de facto reality will emerge.
Taking a look at your overall presentation, it seems inevitable that when there is space given and the one regime loses some of its power base, and there's this space for civil discourse to take place, there is only going to be a small amount of time before an authoritarian dynamic emerges again. And you're constantly combating with civil discourse, that dynamic being able to keep up, have enough space to grow, where it can be a counter to that strong dynamic of authoritarianism that's going to rise. How do you begin to stimulate that global discourse or that mentality so that actually it can hold the space long enough to actually, gain some ground? What is, this inevitable cycle that keeps happening?
Great question. And it's linked to another question, which, keeps me busy and others, who work in the region, and that is how authoritarian regime reproduce themselves. It's incredible. You've got a self-styled secular regime, Assad, gone. You've got a new regime with jihadi Salafi roots using exactly the same authoritarian playbook. Exactly. But this time around, he comes, Ahmed Shara, from the majority, the Sunni majority, right? And Assad came from the Alawite minority. But actually, the political mentality is exactly the same. So this is the biggest challenge for civil society. And changing political culture, that's a huge struggle. It takes time. It's ups and downs. What is destructive in the Middle East is the impact of geopolitics. If there was a favorable, conducive context geopolitically, things could have been different in Syria. But we don't have it. We have what I call counter-revolutionary forces coming together, regionally and internationally, supporting the new authoritarianism at their peril.
Thank you so much. You seem to have a generally pretty damning view of Islamism, the role of Islamists in government. We've seen in other parts of the Middle East, like Tunisia, for example, where people like Rashid Ghannouchi, like from Nahda, for example, has had to abandon radical ideology in order to work within the coalition. I don't know if you've read like Gillian Schwedler's work on the inclusion moderation hypothesis, that Islamists, if they have to contend with the trappings of government, that eventually they're going to have to abandon radical ideology and adopt more moderate positions. Do you think that this is a possibility in the case of HTS or of Shara in particular?
Great question. Thank you so much for this challenging question. And I myself, 15 years ago, used to say they should be given a chance. We should engage them. And I engage them in my work, civil society work, research work, inviting Islamists from Tunisia, from Morocco, from other countries. We should engage them. Hamas, back in the days, And we should always, as academics, we should always be careful not to generalize. And I tell that to myself. We should always be careful not to generalize. But unfortunately, there are some common trajectory, unfortunately. Tunisia is a very special case. So we can't really generalize Tunisia to the entire region. That's different, it's got a different history, Rashid Ghannouchi and others and Nahda, they have a very, very different background and history. But if we study the track record, if you like, of Islamist groups who used to rule over the past 20 years, I think the outcome is not very rosy, to say the least. We had Taliban 1.0. Now we have Taliban 2.0. Don't know what's going on, those who follow Afghanistan in terms of human rights. It's terrible, not only for women, but the entire society. Gaza, Hamas ruled Gaza for, I don't know, from 2007 until October 7. The track record is dismal, dismal. Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, some people, they didn't get enough chance. Maybe that's true. But in that 2 years they ruled, they scared the majority of the Egyptian society. And the mother of all examples, if you like, Iran. We've got the Islamic Republic of Iran, right? It's been in power for 47 years. What is the track record in terms of human rights? Good governance. Tell me. So in Iraq, we have, Shia parties in power that also failed their own communities. The only good news about Iraqi example is that because the political system is so fragmented, not a single group can dominate. So it's more diverse by default, not by design. So the future of Hayat Tahrir Sham STS in Syria, well, I was talking to a Syrian friend a few weeks ago, and I told him, what do you think the future would look like? He said, Kawa, future is today. And today is future. What you see today, that creates our future tomorrow. And unfortunately, it doesn't look very good. It doesn't look very good. I hope I'm wrong. I hope that one day I will be back here and have a better, a better presentation. I hope that I'm wrong. But history gives us some very sobering conclusions, I would say.
Thank you for your time. My question was, so you were kind of talking about knowledge production and that kind of being an issue. And a lot of times with these authoritarian regimes, there's a lot of people that will flee. How do you kind of combat that brain drain of knowledge people, especially those who are against authoritarianism and are able to kind of break that cycle down of authoritarianism ideas and kind of that disseminating it in the public?
Well, through small steps, like the one I mentioned in the case of Syria. There's only so much you can do in an authoritarian state. And, but there are always brave people who, who take risks. And there's a very interesting book by a professor called Asif Bayat, Iranian academic. He wrote an excellent book about Egypt and Iran, and I really recommend to read it. It's called Life as Politics, How Ordinary People Change Middle East. It's a very interesting book about the everyday activism of ordinary people without calling it activism. And that is the part of knowledge we lack when we, when we get despair about lack of progress towards the, a more open space in an authoritarian setting. Whenever I get depressed, I go back to that book. I read it again, and again. And it gives me some hope. Give me some hope that, these societies change in ways which are invisible to themselves and the outside world. And this is not to romanticize societies. This is not to idealize those societies, absolutely not. But I think in certain cases, Iranian society is way ahead of the Iranian regime. Kurdish society, Iraqi societies is way ahead of the political regime. The problem is that to bring about change, as we have seen in Syria, the geopolitics and the violence, they have overhand. You know, because civil society activists, by their nature, they are peaceful. So if they wanted to use arms back in the days, they could have done that, right? You've got jihadi Salafi groups supported by regional international actors who kill people, behead people, and of course they get to power. Now that, you know, it doesn't take a genius to realize that, right? And to come to this conclusion. So what I'm trying to say is that those societies change, maybe sometimes invisible, we don't see it, but they do change, and they are way ahead of their political regimes. And in the long run, I'm reasonably hopeful, optimistic that, you know, things will change for better in those societies with or without international intervention, and probably even despite international interventions.
Thank you so much for these remarks, and thank you also so much for questions. Please join me for a round of applause.
Yes.